Cool. So tonight we're going to talk about JavaScript hoisting. When we start diving into JavaScript a little bit deeper and making more complex JavaScript files, hoisting, if we don't have a solid understanding of it, can really bite us. And hoisting is a JavaScript mechanism where variables and function declarations are going to be moved to the top of their scope before code execution. So I know a lot of times we think about JavaScript as being, an interpreted language. However, there is an engine that's going to compile the JavaScript code before it interprets it. And that is where our declarations and scopes can get moved around. And that's part of the compilation phase before the code is compiled. So we don't have to compile JavaScript code like some other languages where we actually have to compile the code that we're editing before we can run it. But there is a compiler in the browser that's doing that for us before it is executing it and running it. So inevitably, we're going to run into functions and variables, no matter where they're declared, that are moved to the top of their scope, regardless of whether the scope is global or local. So if we look at some examples, let's do a console log, and we say type of, say, variable. Run this. We get undefined. So in JavaScript, an undeclared variable is assigned the value undefined at execution and is also of the type undefined. Now, if we were to change this a little bit, let's do console log variable. We get a reference error. So in JavaScript, a reference error is thrown when trying to access a previously undeclared variable. So the behavior of the JavaScript is going to become nuanced and sometimes confusing because of hoisting. And we're going to look at this some. And should be able to pop this out. There we go. So here's the JavaScript lifecycle in an image. And it shows the sequence in which variable declaration and initialization occurs. However, since JavaScript is going to allow us to both declare and initialize our variables simultaneously, the most used pattern is going to be this third one here, where we say, var a equals 100. And these are where some of the most common patterns can become confusing when we forget that JavaScript is going through this actual pattern here, where it is always going to declare, then initialize our variables. So the variable and function declarations are what are being hoisted to the top of their scope. In addition to that, variable declarations are processed before any code is executed. So there's lots of things going on here. Now, to make it a little more confusing, and this is one of the reasons why people have a love-hate relationship with JavaScript, because there are lots of little details. Undeclared variables, in contrast, do not exist until code assigning them is executed. So assigning a value to an undeclared variable implicitly creates it as a global variable when the assignment is executed. So this means that all undeclared variables are global variables. So we can look at some code to demonstrate this now. So let's create a function. Call it hoist. Say A equals 20. B equals 100. We'll execute this. Console log A. Console log B. And we should see a couple different things. So console logging A is going to output 20. And this is because this is accessible as a global variable outside of this hoist function. And that's because it was not declared. Whereas this B, we get a reference error. B is not defined. And that is because since it was declared, it is going to be confined inside that hoist function scope. So we're not going to be able to print it outside of the confines of that function. So this is one of the little nuances that I was talking about JavaScript and how it handles variables. And that is why we typically always want to declare variables, regardless of whether they are in a function or in the global scope. We always want to set them and declare them because while we could do this, let's say this is a 200-line JavaScript file, somewhere up here we might have A equal to 10, and we're not realizing in here that we're resetting it and changing it. In addition, by always declaring our variables, we are going to clearly tell the interpreter how it should handle them when it runs it. So now let's look at a little bit with ES5, and then we'll look at how ES6 works and some of the differences. So in ES5, we have var. And var was what we had, and var was all we had. So if we go back, let's say console log hoist, we'll get undefined. Or let's finish this file. Var hoist equals this is being hoisted. Okay, so the scope of a variable declared with the keyword var is its current execution context. So this is where I know some people really want to say, never use var anymore because we have let and const. Var is old school, var is never needed, but understanding the scope can make var useful. And it really is one of those things that understanding these little things makes people, one, much more valuable, but able to write better code because there's understanding when to use specific things as opposed to creating and following kind of overarching end-all be-all rules. Nothing against people who believe that, and you can write code without ever using var. But I think knowing the differences and when they might be useful is useful and valuable at the same time. So the current execution context is either the enclosing function, or for variables declared outside of any function, global. So I'll scroll down to my notes. Here, our line 1 is the console log, and our line 3 is our variable declaration and initialization. So when we run this file, we're thinking that, or we would expect, based on what we've seen, to get a reference error that this is not defined, because on line 1 it hasn't been defined yet. But instead, we're getting an undefined. And this is kind of starting to zero in on what's going on and what's happening under the hood. So JavaScript has hoisted our variable declaration. And what is actually going on when we run this code is that it looks more like this. And we see that on line 3, this is going to output undefined. So because of this, we can use variables before we declare them. However, we have to be careful with this because the hoisted variable is going to be initialized with an undefined value. Hence, why we say to, or why one of the overarching patterns that people follow is declaring and initializing our variables at the same time and before we use them. So we can know or have a better understanding or a better expectation of what they're going to be. So now we can look at a function scope variable. And let's say console log, let's say a message. This hoisting stuff gets confusing. And then we'll call our function. So thinking about this, what do we think we'll get? I think based on our previous example, we're going to expect the same sort of output. We have the same pattern. We're just wrapping everything in a function at this point. And we do still get undefined. So once again, the interpreter is looking at code that is more accurately represented like this. And that would bring our expectation to have an output of undefined. So the variable declaration is being hoisted to the top of the function. So it's still enclosed in this function, but that's where it's being hoisted to. So to avoid this, we would declare and initialize our variable on the same line. And with that, we'll get our output. Now, for things that are being written completely in ES5, is something called strict mode. And I adopted using strict mode for a long time. And you can look into what it is and how the rules that it forces people to explicitly follow in their JavaScript files. But it forces us to be more careful about things. So we're going to force ourselves, we're going to opt in to using a more restricted version of JavaScript. And this will not, one of the rules of it is it will not allow us to use variables before they are declared. So one of the other things that strict mode does is it's going to eliminate some of the silent JavaScript errors and make them actually explicit and actually throw errors, which are going to be spit back at us. It's also going to fix some mistakes that make it difficult for our JavaScript to perform well. And it also prohibits some syntax from being used. So using strict mode is simply, or is as simple as adding use strict to the top of a JavaScript file. It can be single or double quotes. Now, if we try and do something funny like console log hoist before we create the variable, what do I want to say? This will be hoisted. Our output will be reference error. Hoist is not defined. So instead of making this assumption that we forgot to declare our variable, this use strict has completely stopped us and thrown a reference error. We can see the difference by, let's comment that out. Wait. Make sure that's saved. So it would be different. Hoist is not defined. Hoist. Oh. I bet that's the difference. Missed that. Let's see. Okay, undefined versus using strict, which will be still undefined. Huh. Well, that's not a good example. Okay. Either way, what was I going to say? Strict mode, this use strict is different in different browsers and will result in different actions. So it's not something that should always be relied on in a production. However, it is something that can force some better written JavaScript, quote unquote better written JavaScript, because it forces you to understand a little bit more what's going on under the hood. And will take some of the silent errors that JavaScript just says, hey, don't worry about it, we're going to keep moving, and throw them, which to some can be annoying, but I think is very helpful, especially as you're learning to write JavaScript and writing it. And yeah, and just learning it and writing new JavaScript, explicitly saying, you know, hey, throw errors and don't just silently pass over things. So now we'll talk a little bit about ES6 and it had a few changes. And the changes were, specifically that we're interested in, is the ones that are going to affect declaration and initialization of JavaScript variables. So there are two new things, let and const. So we'll start with let. And to start, variables that are going to be declared with the keyword let are block scoped and not function scoped. And this is very significant, but we shouldn't really worry about it right now. And briefly, it means that the variable scope is going to be bound to the block in which it is declared and not the function in which it is declared. But let's look a little bit at its behavior first. So let's go with the let. So like before, we get this hoist is not defined. Or like before, we were expecting an undefined because we were expecting this to be hoisted so that, you know, this would be more similar to when we looked at var, you know, we were thinking something like this, and we were expecting hoist to be undefined. However, we get a reference error this time. And that's because ES6 doesn't like us using undeclared variables. And this is going to ensure that we always declare our variables first. We do still have to be careful because we can explicitly do something like this, and we will have an undefined in our code. Or, yeah, can't define it twice. There we go. So, like we saw with var and the pattern, to err on the side of caution, we should declare, then assign our variable before using them. So just, you know, getting it all done on one line. Declare and assign. Now, const was introduced to allow what are called immutable variables. And that is variables whose value cannot be modified once assigned. Now, with const, just like let, it is block scoped and is hoisted to the top of the block. So if we do something like const pi, 3.1415, 3.14159267. At one point, I had like a math class, and they had pi going around the whole top of the room. And I guess when I was bored, I'd try and memorize it. So I know that pretty far. I can still remember it. If that's right, I don't know. I know 3.14 is right. And then let's reassign this. Pi equals 22 divided by 7, which I think, yeah, the fraction that actually is supposed to create the decimal. And then let's console log pi. There we go. And okay. So we get a type error, and we have assignment to constant variable. So let's also, we see that this is an immutable value. So assignment to constant variable. It's not going to allow us this equals to work. So looking at how const is going to alter variable declaration, let's go back to our previous example. Let's say const. And run our code again. Once again, we get a reference error, hoist is not defined. So much like the let keyword, instead of silently exiting with an undefined, we're going to explicitly throw a reference error. And the same thing occurs within functions. So let's say function function to get area. And we have, we'll say of square. So we only need one side. And we have length. So we have one length. We're going to get an area, get the area of the square. So we do something like console log area. Area equals, let's say, length times length. Const. I guess this is, let's say, get area of get area. We'll have the width inside here. Length times width. Const width equals 5. And then we can call this get area 4. Call it again, and we get our reference area, reference error. Area is not defined. So with const, ES6 will go even a little bit further. Oops. And throw an error if we use a constant before declaring and initializing it. Now, if we had, I don't think I have any linting turned on in this folder because I do so many different languages that it gets confusing, I think, for the linter. But if we had linting turned on in this project, it'd most likely be yelling at us, yelling at me, telling me that width is being used before it was declared. And let's see. We should be able to illustrate that. Let's say const width, or const width, console log width, so width equals 5. I'll just comment that up. And we get our missing initializer and const declaration. So it's telling us that a constant variable must be both declared and initialized before its use. So it is worth noting that in ES6, JavaScript does hoist variables declared with let and const. The difference is how it initializes them. So variables declared with let and const remain uninitialized at the beginning of execution, while variables declared with var are initialized with the value of undefined. So now let's look at hoisting functions some. So functions can be classified very loosely as function declarations and function expressions. And we'll look at how hoisting is affected by both types. So going back to our hoisted example, this is going to be a function declaration hoisted. Yes, that's right. Example, console log, function hoisting. All right. So function declarations like this are hoisted completely to the top. And this is why JavaScript enables us to invoke a function seemingly before declaring it. So sometimes you'll see a whole bunch of code written and it's calling functions, and you have a bunch of functions at the bottom of the file. And it's like, how am I calling these functions when they're not even, written yet? And that's because JavaScript is going to hoist those. So this is actually ending up above this function call. Now, function expressions, on the other hand, are not hoisted. If we comment this out, call this expression. And let's just say bar expression, this function, console log, question mark. And let's see what happens. So we had expression is not a function. So this has not been hoisted. So let's try a combination and see what happens. Function hoisted. How about now? Let's see. How about now? Okay, still get expression is not a function. So we can see that the variable declaration is being hoisted, but its assignment to a function is not. And that's why we're getting this type error, since it's seeing this expression as a function or as a variable and not a function. So what's the interpreter is seeing is something more like this. So it's saying, oh, there is a variable, but it's not a function. We can't call it as a function. So a few things to keep in mind when declaring JavaScript functions and variables. So variable assignment is going to take precedence over function declaration. Function declaration is going to take precedence over variable declarations. So we'll look at that. I know it's kind of one of those things you got to keep track of, but if you follow the typical patterns that are taught, and that you see in code, most of this stuff is already happening. So a lot of it, you kind of have to think in a different way to break. So function declarations are hoisted over variable declarations, but not over variable assignments. So let's look at what this behavior might cause. Say double, and we'll make a function, doubles a number, that'll return that times 2. We'll console log type of double. And let's see what happens. So it's a number. So it's getting that double is a number. That's its type. And that is variable assignment over function declaration. Now, let's do something similar. I guess I could have, oh, I don't need to delete all that. There we go. So now we get function. So, and even if we move these around, we're still going to see this as a function. So this is showing that function declarations are over variable declarations. And then our previous example is showing that variable assignment is over function declaration. That's kind of our order of precedence. So still got a little bit of time. Go through one more set of hoisting examples. And this will be class declarations. And this is going to be useful, especially when you move into React and such. So JavaScript class declarations are hoisted as well. However, they will remain uninitialized until they're evaluated. So this is effectively is meaning that you have to declare a class before you can use it. So let's say Frodo is a hobbit. Frodo's height is 100. It's what, like, I guess that's inches, it's really tall. Well, we'll just say it's centimeters. Frodo's weight is, what? Let's say 100. This could be 48. 100 is, no, that's too much. 90. That's still probably bad, but console log photo. And then let's set up our class. Hobbit constructor, the height and weight. That will say this dot height equals height. This dot weight equals weight. That's a nice little class declaration for us. And we're using that before it is declared. So we get a reference error. Hobbit is not defined. And this is telling us that class declarations are hoisted. However, they're not initialized until evaluated. And this is the evidence because we didn't get undefined. Once again, if we had a linter turned on right now, it would be yelling at us and telling us that we're using Hobbit before it is declared. So to access class declarations, we have to declare them first. So simply taking this, moving it before. And now we're seeing that get a Hobbit, a height, and a weight. So much like functions, class expressions are not hoisted. So let's say we want to change this around. Once again. And we'll say our Hobbit equals class so this is going to be a class expression, and this is an anonymous class expression, unnamed, just a different type of variant. And we'll see Hobbit is not a constructor, and that's telling us that we can't do this with Hobbit. It doesn't know what to do with it. Whereas the reference error before was telling us that, it knew it was a class, but we were having issues. And if we were to name this class Hobbit, we get the same error because this code is staying right here. And the interpreter is saying, line by line, we're walking through this. So if we want to do this the correct way, we'll be putting this before all this code. And there we go, our Hobbit type, Hobbit class, the height and weight. So to summarize, we come up towards close to the end of the hour. When we're using ES5's var, or var in ES5, trying to use undeclared variables will lead to the variable being assigned a value of undefined upon hoisting. And while using ES6 let and const, using undeclared variables will lead to a reference error because the variable remains uninitialized at execution. So therefore, we should make it a habit to declare and initialize JavaScript variables before we use them, which I think is by and large the common pattern, as well as the option to use strict mode when using JavaScript ES5, which can help us expose those undeclared variables. So I hope this has helped some in understanding how these things are being moved around by the compiler before they're being interpreted. A great resource is going to be this chapter from You Don't Know JavaScript. I threw that in the chat. If you're watching the recording, just Google it. There's a chapter on hoisting. And it goes deep into it. Any questions at all?
No questions.
Oh, great.